Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of the Nomial Podcast, where we explore topics in Web3. Today, we're going to talk about chain abstraction, and our guest is Tabasco, Head of Developer Relations at Particle Network. Also joining us is Mike, CEO and co-founder of Nomial. I'm your host, Andrew, COO and co-founder of Nomial. And the way I'd like to kick this off is first by just doing some brief introductions and a little bit of overview of Particle and Nomial. So Tabasco, why don't you first give us a little brief intro on yourself and Particle Network?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me. I'm glad to be a part of this in the first episode. So my name is Tabasco. That's the alias that I use. My real name is Ethan. As you mentioned, do developer relations at Particle Network. This means a lot of different things. I basically do a lot of in my role, a lot of marketing and product research and stuff like this, to specifically around chain abstraction. So this has kind of been our major focus for the past year or so. Historically, Particle has always been very focused around user experience and addressing user experience problems in Web3 as to basically make Web3 more consumer friendly. And so this has kind of always been at the center of our goals. So we started doing a lot of social logins. This was our main thing back a few years back, and it's still a service that we do, which is getting people into Web3 using Google and email and stuff like that. Then we kind of graduated that or evolved that into social logins and account abstraction. So we worked really closely with Economy and a number of other account abstraction providers to basically provide users with smart accounts that they can create derived through social login. So I go to an application and I click Google and I have a smart account that I can use. And this is a pretty solid user experience. Then earlier this year, basically in kind of December, January, we kind of decided to evolve this even further and address a problem that we felt was even more pressing than just kind of the day-to-day user experience of onboarding, which is liquidity and user fragmentation. And so this is why we started working on chain abstraction. We're relatively early. We weren't the first to start doing chain abstraction stuff. I think Connex was technically the first, and they actually came up with the term. Arjun from it's Everclear now, but we kind of discovered this idea and felt like this was really important, and our history in account abstraction and in social logins and kind of in user experience armed us really well with the resources and kind of the engineering power to make this vision possible, especially in the context of accounts. And so specifically what we build and what we have been building for the past year is something called universal accounts. Without getting too deep in the weeds right now, universal accounts just basically are smart accounts that give users a single balance across all chains. So if I have 5 USDC on Base, 5 on Polygon, and 5 on Arbitrum, I have 15 USDC that I can use collectively across the ecosystem. It basically allows you to have a single source of assets without bridging. So this is basically what we're building with universal accounts.
Sounds cool. I have tons of questions, obviously, but before we get into it, Mike, do you want to give us a brief background on yourself and Nomial?
Sure. So I'm Mike. Started out in the Web3 space back in 2017. Founded a company called Level K. We were a security auditing and smart contract development firm, one of the first in the space. So got pretty deep on Solidity, smart contract security, just architecture for dApps in general, governance. We built some interesting governance projects, and then did that for a few years. Then started Brink with Andrew. We built general intents protocol. I think it was the first general intents protocol for EVM. Going through that process, we also built a lot of solver infrastructure around general intents and also just solving for limit swaps, which was pretty much the most common use case for intents, all in a single chain context. This was before really we had so many chains. Now, since then, it's become the barriers for deploying a new L2 have dropped so significantly. So now you're seeing L2s pop up probably, I don't know what the number is right now, but there's thousands. And you're basically doing one-click deployments of L2s at this point. So the tooling is so advanced. And that presents a number of problems: fragmentation, liquidity fragmentation, user experience issues around just having gas on various networks that every interaction you do with every chain, you need to have gas on that chain. If you multiply that by 100 chains, that becomes kind of a prohibitively bad user experience. We operated solvers on probably 15 chains and manually managed inventory across those chains, gas accounts to pay various EOAs that need to be funded and constantly like re-upped as they're using more gas. So we just dealt with all these problems firsthand, which led us to building Nomial and focusing on that, which is an inventory access layer that really addresses this fragmentation issue head on. The big one of the, I think, least talked about things in solvers and in the solver space is the fact that solvers actually need to front capital every time they're solving for a cross-chain intent. So they need to front capital for the full amount of the intent they're solving. And in addition to that, they need to have that capital ready on every chain they support. So if you think about the inventory that you need to hold as a solver, that gets incrementally increased as you add more chain support. So this becomes prohibitively inefficient as you add more chains. So what Nomial is creating is basically a way for solvers to access capital on demand from LPs rather than having to provide their own private inventory. And I think we can get into more details on that, but this episode's really to focus on particles. So I will turn it back over to Andrew.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, we will get into that in a second, but there's a topic I wanted to cover before we go too deep on particles specifically. And Tabasco, you were recently on an episode of the Edge podcast, and you did a great job talking about your background and how you came into the space and your journey through the space over time. I recommend if folks are curious about that, they check out that episode. But there's something that I wanted to know more about specifically in that, which is like why developer relations role in particular? Like what led you into that role specifically?
Yeah, so when I first started working on Web3, I was 16 at the time, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. To be honest, like I didn't really know if I wanted to work in Web3. I just kind of, for those that go and watch the episode, kind of the TLDR, what I do is I was working at a tire shop at the time, and I really didn't like it. I hated it, but I needed to have a job, and so my choice was either I do Web3 or I keep like working at that tire shop, and I had already been doing Web3. So I wanted to just like give it a try, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do or if I even wanted to do Web3, if I like really believed in the industry enough to want to work full-time in Web3. And so to be honest, I just applied to like everything that like seemed reasonable that I felt some confidence that I could probably figure out how to do. Like I did some like, very like junior engineering roles or some community management marketing. And I was like, I could probably try to figure this out if somebody wants to give me the chance to try it. And so I ended up stumbling into developer relations because that was the first one that I interviewed for, and that's the one I ended up getting at that time, which was it was like the epitome of entry level. But for me, I mean, they for some reason decided to hire a 16-year-old that had no experience except a tire shop and was still in high school. And so that was like for me, I was like, well, I'll take the opportunity. I'll work in developer relations. I'll kind of figure it out. I knew what developer relations was, and I understood like the idea of it. I didn't really know exactly everything that it entailed, and so I was kind of going in blind. But over time, I realized that developer relations, especially in the beginning, was and still is to a large degree, is it's exactly kind of like what I enjoy doing most, which is like it's very technical. It's quite engineering focused, but it's also very public, and it requires a lot of speaking and interaction. And like I never really enjoyed doing exclusively engineering. I'm not really that type of person, and I also never really enjoyed doing exclusively like just marketing and just communication, because it's also just not really stimulating enough in terms of just like day to day. So having a mixture of like being deep in the weeds on the technical side, being able to help on that side and actually build things out, and also have kind of the more communicative public facing aspect. Over time, I grew to really love that type of role. In the beginning, I didn't really know what I was doing, or like if I were to enjoy this. And so, but I grew into it. And so I started at the first company that I did developer relations for a long time until I eventually started leading developer relations at a company. And that's when I really settled into like, okay, developer relations is the role that I want to do. At Particle, I started doing developer relations for a long time, for about maybe a year, 9 or 10 months. Then I moved into leading developer relations, which now has translated into me being a little bit more on like focused on kind of marketing and communication and stuff like that. And so most of my day to day at Particle is like, I do podcasts like these, I do Twitter Spaces, I write a lot on Twitter. I do videos, and I do some developer relations. I manage a lot of people in this regard and do a lot of coordination and stuff like that. And so as I've been working in the industry now for around 3 years. And as during that time, I've kind of moved from like just doing very pure developer relations and continually like making that higher level until it just becomes a lot of coordination. And I enjoy that as well. But when I first got into the space, I was very captured by that idea of like mixing technical and non-technical. And that was really exciting for me. And I really enjoyed doing that. And that, to be honest, I think if I had started in Web3 in a different role, like in marketing or in engineering, I might have not stuck it out. I might have probably just like, this isn't really for me, and moved on and, continued doing high school or whatever. But it was because I really enjoyed developer relations that I decided to stay with it. And that's why I actually ended up dropping out of high school after working Web3 for a few years. And my senior year, I got my GED and I just left. And that was because I wanted to just kind of dedicate all my time to Web3. And so that's what I've been doing now for the past few years. And it was a good decision so far. We'll see.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that last part. It definitely took like I wouldn't say a risk, but you definitely went all in for sure. It sounds like I like respect that for sure. How do you split your time? Like how much do you do the communications aspect versus more technical work?
It is like 95% communications and coordination for me now. I do a little bit of technical work. We have a developer relations guy that I manage, and so that's usually when I do some of the more technical work, is whenever I'm working with him directly. But otherwise, he does all that work at this point. And so it is for me. The majority of what I do is like campaigns and content, and a lot of writing, and working with our content writers and stuff like this, and events, and all basically everything public facing at Particle at this point is kind of what I do on a day-to-day basis, which I enjoy a lot. I think especially like a reason why I've grown to enjoy this, I think, is unique to the fact that we're working in the chain abstraction vertical. I think if we were working something else where like it was more saturated or something, I might not really enjoy it that much. But I think chain abstraction is interesting, especially from a like public facing perspective and from a narrative perspective, because it is a very rare opportunity, I think, to have like a truly impactful early vertical that is still early enough to where it's like malleable. And like those that are currently in chain abstraction are the ones that are defining what will be, in my opinion, like genuinely a significant impact and a major technological shift for the industry. I think these opportunities in Web3 are very rare to come across. Like maybe the last one was modularity, right? And there's a few people that like did a really great job of shaping that, like Nick White and like the guys from Celestia and a few others that they had the opportunity to be very early and on the ground to that narrative, and they kind of built it out to being this massive vertical that it is today. And so I see chain abstraction as a very similar opportunity where it's like, look, there's a clear value proposition here, and it's still so early. Like there's like maybe one or two chain abstraction protocols that are actually live. It's all just like conceptual mostly right now. So like it's still, and even if you take a step back like 6 or 7 months ago, or even a year ago when we started working on this, at that point there was like 4 companies talking about chain abstraction. It was so like such a small topic. It was basically just like Near started using it, and that's kind of what kicked things off a little bit when Near started using chain abstraction. And that's when a little bit like slowly over time, more people started kind of getting in this idea and buying into it. We started producing a lot of content around it. We worked really closely with the early organizations in the space. And over time, we've seen this explosion into what is like, I think, a top 5 or even maybe even top 3 narrative in terms of growth today. Like the Kaido has this interesting chart. You guys have probably seen it, where it's like you have all these narratives that have grown like 100%, have maybe gone down a lot. And chain abstraction is sitting there at like 700% for the past 6 months in terms of narrative growth. And I think it's for a good reason, and I love to see it. But I think even still, we're at a point in like the larger narrative where it's, those that are building in chain abstraction today, I think, are going to be those that like make this technological shift possible. And so it is such a huge opportunity to actually make real change in Web3 that I enjoy like the kind of day-to-day communication narrative talking about it, because it is a genuinely interesting topic to talk about. And it's been really rewarding to see like the progression of like a year ago, nobody's talking about chain abstraction, to today, it's like a massive topic within the like the Web3 ecosystem. And so watching that progression and being able to be a part of it has been for me like a really exciting day-to-day thing to do. And so I've been happy to like shift more towards basically all my time essentially is on like the non-technical side now. But I still spend a little bit of time on the technical side, but I really enjoy the kind of the communication aspect.
I feel like this could be a whole hour or multiple hours in and of itself. And I'm so interested in how you actually do what you do. I mean, you've grown a pretty meaningful following on Twitter for yourself and for Particle. And I would love to know like how you did that and how you think about that. So maybe perhaps a whole topic in and of itself for another day. But you kind of segued us a little bit there in your answer to the chain abstraction narrative. And I'd love to ask you some more questions about that. How have you seen this narrative evolve? Like, when you first started seeing it pop up to now, and also maybe where you see it going in a few years from now? Like, I would love to just get your perspective on that history and past, present, and future of it.
Yeah, like if you really look into it, chain abstraction is not like a brand new narrative that's only existed this year. I think even Connects, when their first usage of the term was, or Everclear, maybe it was 2 years ago. It was a long time ago, and they used it like themselves to refer to their own architecture, Connect specifically, for a decent amount of time, and it was just kind of their thing that they did, and it was a relatively small idea. And then this graduated eventually into a few more protocols binding themselves to this term. As I mentioned, notably Near started using this. But still, like when Near started doing this, and they like Near really took a risk in terms of like binding themselves to this idea and going all in on marketing for chain abstraction. Like they spent a lot of resources on making this a big idea in the space. I wouldn't say like they were the sole like the growth of chain abstraction themselves, like in exclusivity, but I think they were a significant factor of what has led to the growth of chain abstraction. So like they started using this term, I think that legitimized it a lot. It was like, well, hold on, this huge protocol Near is using this term chain abstraction. What is this? At that point, like, this is maybe February, January, you had the Cake framework. This kind of like followed, some of the initial usage from Near and some of these other guys. Cake framework, I don't necessarily see it as a very good representation of chain abstraction as it's evolved today, as I'll hit in a moment. But I think back then it was like the only real way to understand what is chain abstraction. And the Cake framework was basically answering that question for everybody in a decent capacity at that time. And so you kind of understood generally what it meant. And so that really kicked things off a lot. And then you had Chain Abstraction Day during ETH Denver. And that was an event ran by Near and Frontier Research, the guys that made the Cake framework. And again, still relatively niche. There's very few people working on this. It was a small idea, small narrative. And at that point, we had already started working towards chain abstraction a little bit. We had recognized that. Before ETH Denver, we actually officially announced it, or we had like kind of announced that we're doing chain abstraction. And then we did a big announcement around the time of ETH Denver and stuff like that. And so, but still during that time, nobody really knew outside of like this very small niche, Near, Frontier, us. Maybe at that point there was one or two others that were kind of in the space, or that would eventually rebrand a chain abstraction that were kind of building the same type of product. Nobody knew what chain abstraction really was. It was a very vague and loose term, and it was not well defined. And there was no like, it was so early that like it was just it's like a buzzword basically that we would kind of use, and there was a rough idea around it. Near kind of attached it to like chain signatures, and Frontier had like a slightly different idea for it with the Cake framework. It was very messy. And over time, especially with like Chain Abstraction Day during ETH Denver, that's when we went all in on like trying to talk about it as much as possible. We spent a lot of time producing content, defining chain abstraction. What is chain abstraction? Like talking about it constantly. We have, if you go through our blog, you can see back then, especially like June, May, like kind earlier this year, like we were just hammering out articles, trying to talk about and defining what is this kind of trend that is happening, and trying to like, because like at that point it hadn't really even been recognized as like a new narrative that was like emerging and trending. So we're trying to, alongside other protocols in this space, trying to like say like, look guys, this is going to be a big idea and a big narrative, and this is like the grandiosity of this idea that we have. And so we slowly started seeing more protocols join this kind of this term. So Socket was also one of the very early ones that started working on this, and you had Orb Labs, which kind of joined, and you had Cluster, which was a little bit later, and you had Agoric, which they had kind of built up this term orchestration, and they tied that really closely in with chain abstraction. And so like you had this like slow collection of projects that started saying, okay, I recognize the vision here, and we're aligned with this, and our products that we're building are aligned with this. So like let's build towards this like loose idea of chain abstraction. Then we introduced kind of this article called Formally Defining Chain Abstraction. I think that helped a lot in terms of like giving chain abstraction more of a structured shape, because at that point people didn't really know, is chain abstraction like the abstraction of all on-chain complexities, or is it just like the abstraction of multi-chain complexity? And so it was very vague. And so at that point we kind of defined it. Just specifically, we defined it as a user experience exempt from the manual processes required to interact with multiple chains. And so basically just removing the need to bridge in these different things from end users, right? And so we introduced this kind of formal definition, and then we introduced this like this framework for understanding the chain abstraction stack called the multi-layer framework, which was like application level, account level, and blockchain level. And it gets a little bit complicated, but we basically tried to work with many others. We worked with Everclear, we worked with the Frontier Research guys, we worked with Agoric, with Arc, with Zion, with these different organizations that were jumping into this vertical. And we defined what is the foundations of how you can understand chain abstraction. That really, in my opinion, allowed the vertical to take off even more. Because once people understood roughly, like, okay, I get chain abstraction, I understand the boundaries of what is chain abstraction, what is not chain abstraction. I understand how the stack works. I kind of loosely understand like how the organizations building within the space fit together. And then we were not the only ones building content. And like, it wasn't only us, Near and Frontier and Socket that were talking about it. All of a sudden you had this like very large group of protocols that were all basically bull posting chain abstraction a lot and saying like, look, this is going to be a big idea. This is like the vision on this. This is like, like basically just like continually talking about it, doing videos, doing podcasts, doing live streams, doing Twitter spaces, running events. We had this event during ETH Seoul that, we attended, that we co-hosted or we sponsored, which was Chain Abstraction Day. That was also organized by Near. Then in Brussels, another chain abstraction day. And it's like there's all these flagship chain abstraction events that are happening. And then over time, eventually we kind of organize Abstract Summit during Token 2049, which was very recent. Now we have another one during DevCon. And so it was just this buildup of like a loosely defined term into this like kind of better defined term, and this changing and adapting based on feedback and general narrative. And eventually all these protocols started building up. And I think chain abstraction, because it is so attractive as an idea from a value accrual perspective, like dApps accrue value, chains accrue value. Like it is an objectively beneficial thing for almost everybody, except maybe some generalized L2s and L1s, that it was very easy for people to adopt and kind of be on board with, right? And so I think this is what led into a lot of the narrative growth that we've seen today. And at this point, I would still say that we're far from where we will be in a year or two. Like I don't think we're at the ceiling of the limitation for like the growth of chain abstraction as an idea. I think the challenge now is like we have basically, as a vertical, we've been very successful in evangelizing the idea of chain abstraction, getting people on board with the idea and getting people aligned with what is chain abstraction aiming to achieve, right? The next step is actually shipping and delivering. And I think that will introduce a whole nother sector of Web3 to chain abstraction. Once they can actually see and play with a tangible materialization of the idea that we've been expressing for the past year, I think that will move chain abstraction to a brand new level and actually see like real adoption, real usage, and real excitement beyond just kind of the concept that we've been discussing. So that's kind of how I see the next step, and how I would kind of recap the growth of the narrative this year.
It makes me wonder, and I'd love to get Mike, like your take on this too. Anything that you want to add to that? I have a question though, kind of about it, but I'm curious if you have anything to add first.
Yeah, I think I got the opportunity to use the particle universal accounts beta. And speaking of shipping and delivering, I think this is like one of the prime examples of like really solid chain abstraction UX. I'm curious, given that, and given what you guys have built so far, which is, it's quite amazing. It's really account abstraction, gas abstraction, and chain abstraction in one application. And you guys executed that super well. But like, what's next? So like, what are the limitations that we have? Like, I think we all agree that like, that's an amazing product, but there's still so much more to be built. Like, what in your mind is like the next level? Like, what's the progression of this?
Can I add something to that too, just a little bit?
Yeah,
I'm also wondering,
totally.
what is going to be the killer app, or I guess another way of saying it, what's going to drive the demand from the end user perspective to actually want to use some sort of chain abstraction stack? I mean, if 99% of users, I'm not saying this is the case, but let's just say hypothetically, if 99% of users just want to trade meme coins on Solana and they don't want to move across a bunch of chains, like what happens to chain abstraction? And what is going to drive that demand? So the future of it, what is the future of it from an implementation perspective, but also how does this affect and what's driving the demand from the end users?
Yeah, these are really good questions that are going to allow me to hit a number of different topics that I think are interesting. So
do you want to actually, before we get too deep into it, like actually give some context on what Particle is built?
Yeah. So the demo that Mike is referencing was kind of like an early, very internal version of universal accounts, which, as I mentioned, is basically just a smart account that gives you the ability to have a single balance across chains. And so that demo was it was functional on mainnet. Like that was all real money that you use. It was like all on mainnet, but it was an isolated environment. It was an internal demo to basically showcase, like, we would drop you some funds spread across a few different chains, and you could do one transaction, and that would like consolidate all the funds and like automatically bridge them and use solvers for this. And it was our first real achievement of chain abstraction, this idea that we've been pushing in like a mainnet environment. And so we wanted to share that with everybody. And so we basically attached a very simple front end to it and allowed everybody to like go and try what is like a pretty rudimentary example of what chain abstraction will look like. And so it gave people like an idea of like, I can see how this will be applied across the board. And so like that application, we're not necessarily going to like, that will be used to some degree, like that type of UI and stuff like that. But universal accounts are basically a neutral infrastructure to some degree. So you can look at universal accounts the same way that you would look at like a smart account, right? Because like as a smart account, I can apply that to a wallet. I can add a smart accounts to wallets. I can add a smart account to an application where my MetaMask EOA automatically like is a signer for a smart account. And so like it's like universal accounts are positioned the same way, where applications will support universal accounts natively as like a means of the account that you use to interact with that app, or wallets will implement universal accounts. So this is going to be like the next step that we see in terms of like standard user adoption, is like apps will use it and wallets will use it. So as a wallet, like we're going to start with probably smaller wallets that will implement universal accounts as the main way of actually using that wallet. So your balances are unified. You go to whatever application that you want to do, OpenSea, even Solana applications, whatever, and you use your universal account and you do transactions, and it automatically kind of consolidates balances. So universal accounts as an infrastructure, we see the relatively short-term future of that going to be implemented in a number of like pretty solid apps, a number of pretty solid wallets. But also, in terms of initial user demand and kind of like the next steps for actually shipping a product, I am personally a pretty strong believer in like the idea of building infrastructure and then leading by example and building something on this infrastructure that you built, right? So like we're building universal accounts. I don't want us to like release universal accounts and kind of like sit there and like look at the clock and say, okay, like where's all the builders like that want to use chain abstraction, like who's ready to implement it, and like just sitting there and like doing hackathons or whatever, and like hope like crossing our fingers and hoping that people are going to actually use it. I think a far more effective way to actually get people excited about it, get user buy-in and get developer buy-in, is for us to actually build something on the infrastructure that we've done and build something that's more consumer facing and build a product on it. And like this is partly like because we want people to like get excited about chain abstraction, and partly selfish because like we kind of looked at the stack and we're like hold on, like wait a second, like this is a massive opportunity to like create a ton of value from an application perspective. So like we kind of want to be the first ones to like make a move on that and introduce like a chain abstracted app. And so basically the way that we're looking at it is from like we want to like introduce the industry to chain abstraction in a broader format through a consumer app, like an actual like a product that uses universal accounts that we're actually getting ready to release in like 2 weeks. So we're going to do like a rough announcement of it next week. It's going to be like a very I can't say too much about like exactly what it'll be, but it's going to be the first completely chain abstracted experience that is like a user facing product. It's going to have like it's going to fit very well within the industry, and I think fix a lot of like issues for users. And so with that, we're positioning it to be like hopefully a sort of light bulb moment for chain abstraction infrastructure, right? Sort of like Friendtech with Privy, how like Privy and Friendtech, like that implementation and that like moment where people like understood that, okay, I get the value of social logins in Privy, that propelled them and that infrastructure like hugely. So what we're hoping is like by introducing an actual product and like a real implementation that users can actually get their hands on and actually use day to day of chain abstraction, that will sort of create like this light bulb moment where they say, okay, I get it, I understand the value here, and I want this across the board. And that demand, just from a user perspective, that demand of like, this experience is valuable to me and I want to use this beyond just this single application. Like I want this to be my experience across Web3. I think that will push developers, and they'll also recognize the value of this, and they're going to want to implement this. And so I think the same way that Privy grew from Friendtech, we want to basically be the first ones to actually show people like this is what chain abstraction is capable of. This is like what that product looks like. From the other perspective, I think dApps that will implement universal accounts, and not just universal accounts, to be clear, like you have Magic accounts, you have Orb Labs, and these other guys that are also kind of building adjacent solutions to us. I think they're going to see similar types of adoption where like chain abstraction is interesting because it is almost an objectively valuable implementation for nearly every application. Because as an application, like my addressable market is typically limited to the chains that I choose to deploy on, right? So if I'm deploying on Base and Arbitrum and Polygon, my addressable market is pretty much just users on those 3 chains, because otherwise I need users to bridge into these chains and then use my application. It's hard to motivate users to actually bridge across chains to use your app unless you're paying them, unless you're giving them an airdrop or something, right? And so for most apps that aren't incentivizing users, it's very tough to actually increase your addressable market that much. And so chain abstraction effectively fixes that whole problem. Like as an application, I can implement a chain abstraction solution and basically 10x my addressable market to not just the chain that I deploy on, but the entire Web3 industry with one integration, right? Because like if any user can access my application without bridging, then like there's no barrier to using my app, right? And so I think a lot of applications will realize this. They're going to say like they're going to realize that chain abstraction is basically an opportunity to 10x their potential user market. And like from a business perspective, this is a no-brainer. And so I think that that's going to be a big push for integrations. We're going to see user demand from some of these initial implementations that we are working on, as well as many others that are kind of also working on some consumer apps that will use chain abstraction. I think that will start a shift. It'll take some time. I think it'll be maybe 2 years or approximately before like chain abstraction is like maybe less than 2 years. I don't know. We'll see. But until chain abstraction is like the standard experience for all users, like every application that I use, every wallet that I interact with is by default chain agnostic. I think that will take more time, but my hope is that like the progression right now is going to be like, some of the first products are going to like wow people, hopefully. And developers are going to realize the value, users are going to realize the value, and that's going to kick off kind of like a chain abstraction renaissance. So it'll take some time, but I think we're getting very close to that point. And so we're just like weeks away from introducing some of these things at Particle, and we're very excited about that. So I think that's kind of like the next steps and how we see like these products being actually implemented.
That's interesting. I mean, personally, I feel like the biggest obstacle for me as an end user, I'm not sure if this translates to everyone, but it's more of the security side. I mean, like there's a leap of faith I have to take there's definitely more infrastructure involved in any chain abstraction stack than me simply just having an EOA wallet, right? And I trust that traditional experience because that's what I've been using for years. And for me to take that leap of faith and now trust some abstraction stack with my assets, it's a pretty big leap. So I think that there will be early adopters for sure that are willing to take that risk in exchange for the ease of use that it brings to them, and they'll be early adopting apps. But I really think that 2 years that you're talking about, I think a lot of it is just a lot of people are going to want to see this thing in the wild working with no, loss of funds. And then before they're willing to say, you know what, okay, I'm going to use this chain abstraction stack in order to, get this massive step up in usability. because now it's been de-risked in the wild substantially because a ton of people have been using it. I mean, maybe, I don't know if that's a popular take or not. I mean, Mike, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's not just usability. I think that's the key. And Tabasco touched on this. Like, as an app developer, you have to make a decision where to deploy your app. And app developers generally do that based on the liquidity that's available. So like if you're deploying on Base, you're basically limited to whatever users are on Base with whatever liquidity they have on Base. And trying to get your users to bridge into Base is friction for them. So I think thinking about like from the app perspective, like apps will probably be the early adopters of this because they want that universal liquidity. Like it's so much easier for me as an app creator to deploy in one place or deploy on an app chain with no friction around moving funds to the app chain for anyone that's interacting with my app. And yeah, if you think about something like, Unichain is obviously like the spearheading this like app chain. Like they're the biggest, I would say the biggest company in the space that's deploying an app chain at this point. There's others, but they're the biggest one. And what happens when every user of Uniswap now has to bridge funds to Unichain? It's that creates friction. So there's serious incentive, I think, for apps like Uniswap and many others to embrace these frameworks just to unify the liquidity across many chains, and that is a usability benefit ultimately. But I think that could happen quite quickly, and potentially without users even having to like opt into it. It's just like the apps they're already using start adopting these solutions, or the wallets they're already using adopt these solutions, and then that brings everything together.
Yep. Yeah, I agree with that actually. I think that like, in terms of what you mentioned with like potential pushback or people that would be unwilling to adopt it, I do think like a lot of wallets will, as Mike mentioned, just like adopt it, and like users will just kind of use that because they're already using that wallet. And there's like, sometimes people are worried about like that forcing people into an experience that they don't want, because chain abstraction, to be fair, does take away control. And so like this is just like, to abstract, you have to remove control from many users. Right now, the thing is that as a user, or at least like default control, because as a user, I'm forced to specifically control and be mindful of every condition and property of my transaction as it relates to the underlying chain, right? And so like I need to be aware, I need to like be mindful of and manage like, okay, where are my balances? How do I get balances between these chains? Like this is something that users are required to be mindful of. So chain abstraction is by default making that experience to where they don't need to do that anymore, and those decisions or those like operations that they would typically need to like manually do and be mindful of are removed from them and done for them, which is like the cross-chain bridging and needing to like manage funds across chains and move things between chains or whatever. This is abstracted away and it's done for them. And so I think for especially newer users, this isn't like actually non-negotiable for them, because they can't, most normal people are incapable of or unwilling to go through the cognitive friction of managing chains and having to think about this at all. If it's anything more than just like I go and I click buy on this application and I use it and it works for me, and I go and use another application that works for me, anything that is a step beyond that, for most people, is the drop-off point for them. So I think chain abstraction is going to be the default for them. But for like existing Web3 users, I agree, and I think a lot of them are going to take some time to adopt chain abstraction. Even if like wallets implement it and applications implement it, I do think there's going to be a group of people that are skeptical of it and that don't want that control to be removed from them. So I think that the ideal future, and I don't think that though that group will necessarily like, I think a lot of people will always feel that way, because there's some like, it's just a big part of Web3 is having that type of control. And so I think that ideally the future that we're going to see is that chain abstraction, and I think it was Dean Triple from Agoric that initially kind of positioned it this way to me. We're on a panel and I always reference this idea that like chain abstraction by default will be an abstracted experience, but for end users that want that control, they can access that. So it's sort of like the analogy that Dean always gives is like booking a flight, right? So like when I want to book a flight, I all I know is I want to get to Buenos Aires like next week, and I want to be there for 3 days, and I want to return on the 20th. If that's all I care about, then fine. Like I can just book the flight. It'll just find whatever, like the cheapest one or like the shortest flight for me, and it'll just book it, and I'll go and I'll fly there and I'll fly back. Right. So like I could take a path and I could do that. That is basically, there's a lot of decisions that are made for me. There's decisions about the seat that I have. There's decisions about the economy of the flight, like the climate impact of the flight. There's decisions about like the type of seat that I have in terms of like, am I economy or am I first class or whatever. Like, so there's things that I don't control in that decision that I'm just like, for convenience and for speed, I'm just like letting it kind of make some base decisions for me. But in that same experience in Web 2, if I really want to have very granular control over every aspect of my flight, how long is a layover? From which airport am I departing? What type of seat do I have? Whatever. Like, is this flight gonna have some CO2 emission? I don't know. Some people, So like, if I want to control those aspects and I want to make decisions based upon those specific constraints, then I can, and I have access to that in these front ends. So I think chain abstraction is going to evolve in a very similar path, I hope, which is that the default is that it's going to be the simplest possible path for users. It's going to make these decisions for them. It's going to abstract away as much complexity as possible as a default. But if as a user, I want to access information, I want to change conditions, I want to act upon my own will in some of these transactions, then I can do so. And that's not forcibly stripped from me. That the control isn't removed. It's just by default kind of abstracted away. And so I think this is going to be, I think this will give a lot of people peace of mind and like kind of make it easier to buy into this vision, because it's like, okay, well, if I can still control these things and it's not removed from me, then maybe I feel more comfortable about this, because then I don't feel like I'm I'm kind of entering a dark tunnel. I don't really know what's happening with my assets. So I think is a valid concern for a lot of people. So this is kind of how I see that specifically being addressed in terms of like concerns, especially with like existing crypto users.
You said something in there that really stuck out to me that made me think is, you said a big part of Web3 is having that control. It's an interesting statement. I mean, you're totally right. I mean, it's what drew me into Web3. It probably drew a lot of people into Web3, and the idea of chain abstraction is super compelling from a usability perspective, from a addressable market perspective for apps. So how do we do that but maintain the control at the same time? Something like the ethos of what Web3 is all about without just completely giving it away. I think you laid out a pretty compelling vision for that. It's like you make me think of booking a flight on something like Kayak. Like I'm the type of person that will adjust every single knob to find my perfect flight, right? But some people are just like, give me the cheapest one, right? So there's a spectrum there. We have like 5 minutes left. So many things I want to cover that we can leave for another day, but something we haven't talked about yet is solvers. And that is another kind of element, another group of people or organizations that we need to bring into this to get this to work. So from your perspective, like how do you think about bringing solvers to Particle, and what is the challenge there that you see, and how many are there, and how easy is that today, or is there still a lot of work to be done on that?
Yeah, so for context, like, within universal accounts, we use a solver system to move funds across chains. The reason that we use this instead of like, traditional like mint and burn bridging or whatever is just because solvers are a proven model to be incredibly efficient and specifically time efficient. It's like we've got it to a point now where you can do a cross-chain transaction that involves multiple chains in less than 3 seconds. Like basically very similar to a cross, sometimes even faster. And so right now, our system is one solver ran by Particle, because it's just our demo, and it's very we want it just to work to start, and then over time we'll say, okay, like it's functional, it's reliable, it works. Like it's very new technology here, so we don't want to like try to go too far too quickly. Over time, we want to introduce more solvers. We want to allow anybody to provide liquidity and to expand the network and to run solver and earn fees for doing so. And so over time, we really want it to be a decentralized system of solvers that participate and move funds across transactions for users that are using universal accounts. I think the economic incentives will be there to do so, because every transaction we're taking a little bit for the solvers and the providers of that liquidity, and basically paying them for doing that cross-chain transaction. And so just by doing volume, there's pretty good benefits from doing so. And we specifically use like our liquidity system is pretty interesting. Where like we use like right now, and I think in the future, we want to migrate to a solution like Nomial, and I'll get into in a second because of some of the challenges that are around traditional liquidity management with solvers. But with us, we basically maintain one pool of liquidity on every chain, and specifically we denominate that in USDC. And so we don't maintain specific pools for every token because that's just not possible, especially when you want to support like new tokens or tokens that like we can't have liquidity pools for every, because it's just like not sustainable. There's so many tokens, right? And so the way that we're doing it is we're just every chain we just have a big pool of stable coins, and we'll do swaps between the origin token and the destination token as long as there's sufficient liquidity to make that possible. So if I want to pay for gas using Dogecoin, like some derivative Dogecoin on Solana, then I can do so as long as there's liquidity to swap that to USDC and pay the solver, pay the paymaster, the filler, whatever you want to call it, to fund that transaction, right? And so that's how we're doing it. But to be honest, and I think we were talking a little bit about this before we started recording, I really do believe that one of the biggest problems and like unsolved things, at least currently unsolved, that are being worked on in chain abstraction and largely like larger like solver-based bridging, I think is liquidity management or inventory management, right? Especially as it relates to this like app chain centric future. I did a tweet last night where I said like I truly believe that there are going to be thousands of app chains, and most larger applications will launch an app chain over the next few years. And for chain abstraction solutions, there needs to be a way to service all of these app chains. Otherwise, basically everything that we just talked about doesn't matter. Because if you can't service all these app chains, like what's the point? You're only going to service like Base, Ethereum, and Polygon and Solana or whatever. Like, so, but the challenge there is like I have to maintain liquidity for all of these chains. I have to have liquidity pools for all these chains. I have to have enough, because basically the ceiling of that liquidity pool is a ceiling of whatever I can send through that solver. So we have, let's say, I don't know what the exact number is, but let's say we have $50,000 in liquidity. I want to send $52,000. You can't do it. Send $50,000 first and then send the remaining $2,000. And we actually ran into this issue with our demo where some people deposited thousands of dollars into our demo and wanted to play around with it. And our system said, well, hold on, we don't have liquidity for this. Like, you're trying to deposit like $5,000. We actually don't maintain that much liquidity in this demo. And so we needed to like deposit a bunch of liquidity there, like have them like do it in increments. And it was this whole thing. And so like this is a problem, especially when you start going across multiple chains. So this is something that we're monitoring very closely. I know that of course Nomial is attempting to address it as well. So this is kind of like how we see the solver landscape at the moment.
Mike, do you want to comment on it? I know Mike has to jump, but I can keep going a little bit longer. Tabasco, if you can.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, before I go, definitely have thoughts on that. Yeah, that's super interesting that you guys are maintaining a USDC pool on every chain that you support, and that's kind of like the upper limit on the amount of value you can effectively move around in the between different chains. And this is even the problem's made even worse by the fact that you also need liquidity if you want to move it from USDC to any other asset on that chain. So then you're relying on kind of two things: one, your private pool upper limit of what you can provide, and two, the external liquidity on that particular chain. So if we're talking about this in the context of an app chain, that's really difficult, because now that app chain needs to have effectively like an AMM deployment where they can support that amount of liquidity. Plus, you need to actually provision a new pool for the app chain of USDC in order to support that. So this really gets at like one of the core problem that we're solving, which I mentioned at the beginning of the call, which is every chain that you add support for whatever inventory amount you have to multiply that by the number of chains you support. So if it's $5,000 on 10 chains, that's $50,000. If you add a 51st chain, that's $55,000. So you actually, as the solver, you guys are running a baseline solver for protocol. You actually need to incrementally increase your inventory every time you add a new chain. So yeah, it's a huge problem. I think something that we're aware of and we're working on solving. I think there is another problem in there, which is how do you actually get the liquidity on that chain? Like moving the USDC to another token. I think that's a really interesting problem. Wonder if you have more thoughts on that. But one thing is like potentially the whole chain abstraction solution, like all these teams coming together, could fix that by allowing you to swap on another chain in order to get liquidity back to that chain. I think there's some latency challenges there and other things around that, but that's something that we could really dig into, and definitely don't have the time on this pod. But I think these are, like you really pointed out, like two critical problems with liquidity and chain abstraction and solvers. So that's super interesting.
Yeah, like I think these problems, especially when it relates to multi-chain liquidity management, need to be solved. Otherwise, chain abstraction is not sustainable across kind of this type of feature. And so I think they're incredibly critical to focus on over the next few months. And I think these are one of the only remaining blockers, in my opinion. There's like some other blockers, like whatever, adoption and kind of like more superficial things. But from a technical perspective, I think that these are like this problem that we just discussed is massive. And so yeah, we're thinking a lot about this and how we can position ourselves long term. And of course, this is why we're quite excited about Nomial, and we've done some posts in the past about like how Nomial could fit into Particle's universal liquidity system and this type of thing. And so it's something that we're quite excited about. In terms of like what you mentioned just there at the end, like the liquidity available on these other chains, it's the way that we're thinking about it is like you can pay for transactions using an asset on a destination chain or on an origin chain that is different from the asset on the destination chain. And so if I want to pay using ETH and the destination chain asset is in USDC or it's in some other token, as long as that chain has liquidity for that, for whatever the destination asset is, then that's fine. It doesn't need any more liquidity. So we just need liquidity on the origin to swap to USDC, and we need liquidity on the destination to swap from USDC to whatever the destination asset that needs to be used for that transaction is. There's a lot of problems associated with just that, but this is kind of how we're thinking about it, and it is definitely like I think it's going to continue being a bigger problem as Web3 scales and as more chains are introduced. And so we're very excited about solutions like Nomial right now.
Mike, do you have to jump?
Yeah, I'm going to jump, but it was good chatting. Thanks, Ethan.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Mike. Ethan, you got like another 15 minutes?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I have a question on a couple of things you said there. So something we haven't talked about yet too much. How does chain abstraction, well, actually, let me even walk back further. I mean, chain abstraction and this whole narrative of intents have kind of come up around a similar time. Not exactly the same, but similar timing. And you mentioned something earlier about speed and timing, and that made me want to bring up the intents side of this. So to you, like, can you give us context? Well, for you, like, what does intents mean and how does it relate to chain abstraction? What is this whole buzzword of intents, and how does it all tie together?
Yeah, it's I did a few talks about intents. We did an event on intents during Istanbul of last year. I think maybe Brink did an event out there as well. I think Brink was actually a part of the it was called intent.wtf that we did, and then I think you guys did one as well. I forget what it was called. Was it Good Intentions?
Yeah, Good Intentions. So for context on that, like we started, since we built an intent framework with Brink, we started this Telegram group called Good Intentions, and that was something that was a collaboration between like several people at Brink, like Kaylee, for example, who was doing head of growth. We had this idea of creating a Good Intentions group to just bring together people in the intent community, especially, this is perhaps more than a year ago now, where this buzzword was coming up, and it seemed like a good word to describe something that a lot of people were doing. And we thought it'd be good to get a group together of like-minded individuals working on that problem. So we created this Good Intentions community. And then we said, well, why not run an event in Istanbul during the conference at that time? So we did a Good Intentions event and had some folks present, and we had panels and presentations all day. So that was super, super fun, exciting. And I think, a lot of folks kind of were doing mind share at that. And I know you guys did your intent.wtf thing as well. And that was awesome to see that. And now you're seeing at DevCon, there's going to be an intent day as well. So it's definitely something that is still on people's mind, and there's a narrative going kind of hand in hand with chain abstraction and intents. I'd say that to me, intents is maybe a mechanism or a methodology to implement some parts of chain abstraction. So I'm curious to you, like what does intents mean to you first off, and how do you see it relating to chain abstraction?
Yeah, like I think formally the word intent in the context of Web3, I liked the way that Essential defined it. I don't remember the exact definition that they used. I don't know. They published this article that I always refer back to, which is a formal definition of intents. And they used like maybe it was a condition on a state transition function or something like that. I don't know. But anyways, they gave this very academic definition to it, which I liked a lot. I think in the context of chain abstraction, intents play a very narrow role. So like intent started, especially back then, as like this idea of like it was took a more generalized form, where like most transactions would kind of be intent based, and you'd be able to kind of like define an end state, and there would be a sequence of transactions that would achieve that. I think the ethos of how intents were understood and kind of expressed, back during, for example, the Good Intentions event and the during Istanbul, is very similar to like how chain abstraction functions, but it's just very narrow, right? So like intents, or more specifically, like I use the word intents. I also like solver-based bridging is usually a little bit more specific, which is just that I think it basically allows for an intent, but very specifically in the context of I have funds on chain A, and I want my intent is, or my goal is to get is to fill a transaction or do something on chain B. What do I need to do to get to that point? In this case, you have solvers that front the liquidity for doing so. And so the reason why this has taken prevalence, I think I'll give credit, to Across for like being one of the pioneers of like this intent-based bridging model, solver-based bridging model. And they did a fantastic job of like making this clear that this was a better approach, to be honest. And like some people disagree with me on that, I'm sure, but I think it's a better approach than most mint and burn bridges. Don't tell the layer zero guys I said that, but I think that that's the or like token standard stuff like that. I think that intent-based bridging is a very efficient way, especially in the context of something like chain abstraction, to move funds across chains, because simply the property of, and to be fair, it does move things off chain, and there's considerations with that, but simply having an off-chain entity to have this agreement with, to say, I will front liquidity for your transaction, you'll repay me on X amount of chains that you have funds on. It's a very simple agreement, and it's incredibly efficient, because there's not like contracts that we need to wait for, or like there's not a whole lot of settlement that you need to wait for. And so like you don't need to wait for a certain amount of block confirmations. It's very simple, and it's incredibly efficient as a result. And so like I don't know if there's really a way to bridge across chains today that doesn't use intents or doesn't use solvers that can happen in less than 3 seconds. I think it's almost exclusive to solvers. The only exception I would say is maybe there's like you have like node kit super builders that allow for atomic composability between chains, and that can allow for cross-chain transactions in like less than 2 seconds, because it's they're actually truly atomic transactions. But I think when you're looking at just like every blockchain, having a solver agreement to move funds across chains and using that as a main means of bridging, it's so efficient that it is almost required for chain abstraction. Because if I'm doing a transaction as a user and I want to remove the feeling of using multiple different chains and making it all feel like one chain, if it takes any more than 15 seconds to do that transaction, because I'm waiting for settlement, or I'm waiting for some bridge confirmations, or some verifiers or something to go through my bridge transaction, and it takes anything more than 15 seconds or a minute, then the whole illusion or the perception of like balance unification is effectively removed, and it kills the user experience. And so the only way to really feasibly achieve chain abstraction across chains and have these transactions be executed, especially whenever you're involving this idea of like, oh, I want to do a transaction for $15 on base, I have $5 spread across three other chains. There's a lot of complexity attached to that. I need to move $5 from 3 chains to fill this transaction on one chain. Doing that traditionally with bridges would be a massive headache, whereas with solvers, that's a very straightforward transaction. Like that is not a necessarily difficult thing to do, and it's still very fast. Even though you're doing transactions with 4 different chains here, the agreement is effectively the same. It's just I'm being repaid from those 3 different chains rather than one chain. And so it's a need for chain abstraction. Some people would argue that, chain abstraction doesn't need solvers, it doesn't need intents. I would generally disagree with that. I think that to have the type of user experience that actually achieves what we want to do with chain abstraction, you need intent-based bridging and you need solvers. Otherwise, the only other option is like you have things like AgLayer, you have things like Superchain, which can allow for very efficient cross-chain transactions, like native mint and burn functionalities and things of this nature, which is fine. But I don't really see a future where the way that we achieve chain abstraction is through exclusively chains that opt in to some roll-up cluster. I think that I don't dislike that model at all, but I think that generally that will be complementary to solver-based chain abstraction. That will be the foundation for like most chains, and then for chains that have that kind of native interoperability, that have atomic composability or whatever it may be, solvers can even use that to some degree, and that would make things even better, more efficient, like more risk-free, that kind of thing. And so I think that's the future that we're moving towards, and it's incredibly important especially for things like universal accounts. And so it's been a massive unlock for us recently.
Yeah, I like what you said at the end there. I mean, even if superchains becomes a big thing, decoupling from the mechanism and just using a solver-based approaches that lets you decouple from the underlying mechanism. So yeah, maybe a solver uses a superchain type thing to get it done. Maybe not, but chain abstraction probably shouldn't be opinionated about that. It should just say like whatever can get it done the fastest is what we're going to reward, and at a good efficient pricing. And we're not going to make a hard line decision as to the mechanism. And so I like what you said there at the end. And even earlier too, I don't think things like layer 0 and stuff are mutually exclusive with an intent-based model. It just so happens to be that they focus on the kind of mint and burn token standard style stuff for now. But I do think it's possible to do intent-based bridges with some layer 0 stuff built in. And like you said, Across was a good pioneer of this, though on the intent side, and really demonstrated in a meaningful way that it works. And we've even seen on crypto Twitter lately a little bit of back and forth going between the Across team and layer 0 team, and that's been a really interesting debate. But I'm not so sure that debate is too much. Well, it's somewhat about the intent-based versus message-based stuff, mint and burn-based, but there's some other things going on in that debate too. I don't think we have time to get too far into that, but I just want to say, first off, thank you for doing this. Thank you for being a guinea pig on a first episode with us. If anything you want to say before we close up, like anything, tell us more about like what people should look out for with Particle coming up, or where they should learn more, anything like that.
Yeah, thanks again for hosting. I think this is a dope initiative, and I'm glad to have been the guinea pig for the first episode. And we are I think in terms of things to look forward to, like the little alpha I can drop is like basically in 2 weeks, 3 weeks maybe, expect a pretty big product release from us. This is going to be the first mainnet consumer facing complete product implementation of chain abstraction. And so we're very excited about this and how the implications it'll have for understanding chain abstraction and the comprehension of it. So you can look out for that. Otherwise, if you're interested in chain abstraction, there's a lot of people building in the space. It's not just Particle. There's a lot of really great work being done here. And so you can go to blog.particle.network. We have a lot of interesting stuff over there that we write with other chain abstraction protocols. We have a lot of content about who's building in chain abstraction, how do they all fit together. And then feel free to, if you Google it, you can find a lot of good articles that we've written and other people have written. Just learn more about it, read more about it. It's a really interesting kind of narrative and vertical, and something that I'm very excited about. And thanks again for hosting. I think I'm looking forward to not only the podcast, but also what Nomial is building. As I mentioned earlier, I really do believe in, I've always been a big advocate of Nomial, even like back when the idea was still pretty early, and Mike originally pitched it to me. I think that was maybe even before like Nomial was like an official, like full idea that was being built out. I've really liked this idea, and I think it's going to be a huge unlock for chain abstraction. So I'm looking forward to it. I hope people find the product that we're going to release to be interesting. And it's going to be a pretty crazy next few months.
Thanks, man. I appreciate you. Until next time.
Likewise, appreciate it.